The Arizona sun in the year 1872 was not a gentle thing. It was a hammer, beating down on the red earth until it cracked into 1,000 fissures, each one a thirsty mouth pleading for a rain that seldom came. Dust was not merely dirt here. It was a constant companion, a fine red powder that coated every surface, settled in the lines of a person's face, and painted the horizon in a perpetual haze of rust and rose. This was a land of sharp edges and muted colors, where life clung to the banks of stingy creeks and huddled in the sparse shade of mesquite trees. Survival was the only law that truly mattered, a covenant made daily with the unforgiving land. In a small cabin built of sun-warped timber and stubborn hope, Evelyn Carter moved with a quiet efficiency that belied her 18 years. She was the youngest daughter of a homesteader, a girl whose world was confined by the neat rows of corn she hoed, the rhythm of the butter churn, and the pages of the family Bible. Her innocence was not one of ignorance, but of isolation. She knew of the world beyond their small claim, but only through the fearful whispers of her father and the grim tales told by dusty travelers. The word Apache was chief among these terrors, a name spoken in low tones, synonymous with ghost-like raids and a savagery she could scarcely imagine. In her mind, they were not men, but shadows with knives, specters of the wilderness that lay just beyond the reach of their lantern light. She was a timid soul, her spirit as delicate as the desert wildflowers that bloomed for a single, glorious day before surrendering to the heat. Her father, Samuel Carter, was an honest man worn down by the land and by a debt he could never repay with coin. He was a farmer, and a good one, but the Arizona soil gave its bounty grudgingly. Years of toil had stooped his shoulders and etched deep furrows into his brow, but the heaviest weight he carried was one of gratitude. 5 winters passed. A sudden rock slide had trapped him in a narrow canyon. His legs shattered, the cold seeping into his bones with the promise of a slow, lonely death. He had been found not by men from the settlement, but by a lone Apache warrior. The man had worked in silence, his movements economical and sure, setting the bone with a painful expertise and building a fire that fought back the encroaching dark. He had shared his meager rations and stayed until Samuel was strong enough to be guided back toward home. The warrior's name was Tatsi, and he had asked for nothing in return. But Samuel knew a life debt was the most binding contract of all. The debt came due on a blistering afternoon in late summer. Evelyn was scrubbing the porch steps when she saw the rider approach, not from the dusty track that led to town, but from the silent, watchful hills. He rode without a saddle, his posture erect, a part of the horse and the landscape itself. As he drew closer, she felt a knot of cold fear tighten in her stomach. It was an Apache. He dismounted with a fluid grace, his long black hair bound by a simple leather cord, his face a mask of calm impassivity. He was not the monster of her imagination. He was just a man, his skin the color of the red earth, his eyes dark and deep, holding a stillness that seemed to draw in the frantic heat of the day. Samuel came out of the cabin, wiping his hands on his trousers, his expression a mixture of recognition and dread. The two men stood for a long moment, the air thick with unspoken history. The Apache spoke first, his voice low and even, the English words carefully chosen, like stones placed deliberately in a riverbed. His name was Tatsi. He spoke of the life that was saved, of the honor between men. And then, his dark eyes flickered toward Evelyn, who stood frozen by the doorway. He had come, he said, not for land or for guns, but to honor the debt in a way that would bind their peoples. He wished to take Samuel's daughter as his wife. The words fell into the dry air, and for a moment, the only sound was the buzzing of flies. It was not a request born of passion. Evelyn understood with a sickening clarity. It was a transaction, a treaty. Tatsi explained his reasoning with that same unnerving calm. A shared family was a bridge. It was a promise of peace stronger than any paper signed by generals. A son born of their union would have the blood of both peoples. He was not seeking to possess her, but to create a connection, a living bond that might quell the bloodshed that was slowly poisoning the land. Evelyn felt the floorboards sway beneath her feet. She looked at her father, her eyes pleading with him to refuse, to send this man away, to protect her. But she saw in Samuel's face not anger, but a profound and terrible sorrow. He saw the honor in the request, the desperate logic. He saw a chance for a peace he prayed for every night, and he saw the weight of his own life, saved by this very man, pressing down on him. He could not refuse. The debt was absolute. Her world collapsed into a suffocating silence. She was to be married, to a savage. The word echoed in her mind, a frantic, screaming bird trapped in the cage of her skull. She felt a profound sense of betrayal, not only by her father, but by the very order of her world. She was a piece to be moved in a game played by men, her life a currency to settle a debt. Her protests were whispers, her tears silent pleas that went unanswered. The decision was made. A traveling preacher was summoned from the next settlement, a grim-faced man who looked at Evelyn with pity and at Tatsi with a suspicion he barely concealed. The wedding was a hollow, wretched affair. It took place in the main room of their small cabin, the air thick with the smell of dust and resignation. Evelyn wore a simple cotton dress, its familiar texture offering no comfort. She stood beside Tatsi, a man whose language she did not speak, whose world she could not comprehend. He was a stranger, a figure from the terrifying stories of her youth. And now he was to be her husband. She could not bring herself to look at him, keeping her eyes fixed on a crack in the wooden floor. She felt the eyes of the few neighbors who had gathered, their gazes a mixture of morbid curiosity and cold sympathy. Their congratulations were muted, their handshakes limp. They were not celebrating a union. They were witnessing a sacrifice. She spoke her vows in a voice so faint it was barely audible, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. When the preacher declared them man and wife, a final, shuddering sob escaped her lips. Through her tears, she saw her father's face, etched with a pain that mirrored her own. He had secured his honor. He had paid his debt. But he had lost his daughter. As Tatsi led her from the cabin, her hand small and trembling in his, she took one last look at the only home she had ever known. The sun was setting, casting long, mournful shadows across the land. It felt like an exodus, not of the body, but of the heart. She was leaving behind not just a place, but the very person she had been, stepping into a future as vast, as alien, and as terrifying as the darkening desert that awaited her. The journey was a silent one. Tatsi moved with a purpose that seemed to ignore the crushing heat and the miles that stretched before them. He had placed her on his horse, a sturdy animal that picked its way through the rock-strewn landscape with an unnerving confidence, while he walked ahead, leading them away from everything she knew. Evelyn clung to the horse's mane, her body swaying with a rhythm that felt alien and jarring. The sun beat down, and the world dissolved into a shimmering mirage of red rock and pale, thirsty scrub. Each step the horse took was a step further into a void, a sundering from her past. The familiar shape of her father's cabin dwindled, then vanished, swallowed by the vast, indifferent wilderness. She was adrift. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the sky, they arrived at a small, secluded camp nestled in a shallow basin between two mesas. It was not the sprawling, chaotic village of her nightmares. There was only a single dwelling, a conical structure of hide stretched over a frame of long poles. Smoke curled lazily from an opening at its peak. It looked temporary, fragile against the immense and ancient landscape. This, she realized with a fresh wave of despair, was to be her home. Tatsi slid her from the horse's back, his hands firm and impersonal on her waist. For a moment, her legs refused to hold her, and she stumbled against him. His body was hard, unyielding as the rock that surrounded them. She pulled back as if burned, her skin prickling with fear. He seemed not to notice, or if he did, he gave no sign. He tended to the horse with quiet efficiency, his movements economical and precise. Before turning and gesturing toward the entrance of the hide lodge, it was a command, not an invitation. Swallowing the lump of terror in her throat, Evelyn ducked through the low flap. The air inside was cool and smelled of smoke, dried herbs, and worn leather. It was a scent both strange and ancient. A small fire pit sat in the center, its embers glowing softly in the gathering gloom. The space was larger than it appeared from the outside, yet it felt profoundly claustrophobic. A few woven mats and fur blankets were neatly arranged on one side. A collection of clay pots, hide pouches, and unfamiliar tools occupied the other. This was his life, stripped down to its essentials, and now it was hers. She sank onto one of the mats, her muscles aching from the ride, her spirit numb. She pulled her knees to her chest and wrapped her arms around them, making herself as small as possible. The last of the daylight faded, and the darkness inside the lodge became absolute, broken only by the faint red eye of the embers. The silence was a living thing. It pressed in on her, magnifying the frantic beat of her own heart. This was it. This was the night she had been dreading since the moment he had spoken his purpose at her father's cabin. Her wedding night. Every terrible story she had ever heard about his people came rushing back. Tales of brutality and violation whispered by frightened women around a cook fire. They were savages, uncivilized, taking what they wanted without gentleness or consent. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the images bloomed in the darkness behind her lids. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps. A single tear escaped, then another, tracing hot paths through the dust on her cheeks. A quiet sob broke from her lips, a sound of pure, hopeless misery. Tatsi entered the lodge, his form a dark silhouette against the star-dusted sky. He carried an armful of dry wood. He did not look at her at first. He moved to the fire pit and knelt, adding the wood with practiced care. He coaxed the embers back to life, blowing on them gently until a small flame flickered, then grew, casting dancing shadows on the hide walls. The firelight illuminated his face, all sharp angles and stoic calm. He seemed utterly absorbed in his task, as if he were alone. The fire grew stronger, a small sun in their enclosed world. It pushed back the darkness and the cold that was beginning to seep up from the ground. It also created a visible barrier, a shimmering wall of light and heat that separated the two sides of the lodge. Evelyn watched him, her tears now flowing freely, her body trembling with a fear so profound it was a physical ache. She waited for him to turn to her, to cross the fire, to claim his due. The crying was louder now, a raw, desperate sound she could no longer contain. He finally looked at her. His dark eyes held the reflection of the flames, and in their depths, she could see no lust, no anger. She saw only a quiet, unnerving stillness. He watched her weep, his expression unreadable. He did not move closer. Instead, he reached for a thick, folded blanket made of buffalo hide. He stood, walked around the edge of the fire, and placed the blanket on the mats beside her. He did not touch her, did not even let his fingers brush against her dress. He simply set it down, a silent offering, and retreated to his side of the fire. He sat down again, his back to the wall, and continued to watch her. The firelight softened the hard lines of his face, but his intensity never wavered. Her sobs began to subside into ragged, hiccuping breaths. The air was thick with tension, with the unspoken terror of the moment. Then he spoke. His voice was low, cutting through the crackle of the flames, the words simple and clear. "You are safe here." It was not a question. It was not a command to stop crying. It was a statement, a promise delivered with the weight of absolute certainty. The words landed in the chaos of her mind and were like a stone dropped into a frantic pool of water, the ripples spreading outward, calming the storm. She looked at him, confused, searching his face for some sign of deception, some hidden meaning. But there was none. There was only the steady, unwavering gaze. He held her eyes for a long moment. Then he seemed to come to a decision. He turned away from her completely and began to prepare his own sleeping area on the opposite side of the fire. He unrolled a thinner blanket, lay down upon it, and pulled a second one over himself. And then, in a gesture that spoke more loudly than any words, he turned his back to her. He lay perfectly still, a solid, unmoving form facing the far wall of the lodge, leaving her entirely to her own space, separated by the protective circle of the fire. Evelyn stared at his back, at the strong line of his shoulders, the fall of his dark hair against the blanket. He had done nothing she expected. There was no aggression, no demand, no force. There was only the fire, the blanket, and the quiet promise of safety. He had given her space. He had given her respect. The tension that had held her body rigid for hours began to slowly, painfully, unwind. The trembling eased. Her breathing deepened. The tears came again, but they were different now. They were not born of terror, but of a profound and bewildering relief. It was a release of the fear she had carried all day, all week. Ever since he had ridden out of the hills, she pulled the heavy buffalo robe he had given her around her shoulders. It was warm and heavy, a comforting weight, and it smelled of wood smoke and sage. She lay down on her side, facing the fire, and watched the flames leap and sway. On the other side of that flickering light, the man who was her husband slept, or pretended to sleep, with his back turned to her. The strangeness of it all was overwhelming. She was in an Apache lodge, in the heart of the wilderness, married to a man the world called a savage. Yet, in this wild and alien place, she felt a sense of security she had not felt even during her own hollow wedding ceremony. He had seen her terror, heard her cries, and had answered not with violence, but with a quiet, powerful act of kindness. The night was still and deep, the silence of the desert absolute. Exhaustion finally washed over her, a heavy, welcome tide. As her eyelids fluttered closed, a single, revolutionary thought formed in the quiet corners of her mind. Perhaps she had been wrong about him. Dawn arrived, not with a gentle blush, but as a sharp, silver line drawn across the dark rim of the mesas. The light spilled into the lodge, chasing the last of the shadows from the corners and revealing the fine layer of red dust that coated everything. Evelyn woke with a start, her body stiff, the heavy buffalo robe tangled around her legs. For a disoriented moment, she did not know where she was. Then, memory returned with a cold, clear rush. She was in an Apache lodge. She was a wife. She sat up, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm against her ribs. Tatsi was gone. His sleeping furs were neatly rolled, and the fire had been fed with fresh wood, its flames crackling with a cheerful energy that felt at odds with the apprehension coiling in her stomach. The silence of the previous night was gone, replaced by a symphony of unfamiliar sounds from outside, the distant nickering of horses, the high-pitched laughter of a child, the rhythmic thump of something being ground against stone. It was the sound of a world waking up, a world that was now, impossibly, her own. Hesitantly, she rose and made her way to the entrance flap. Pushing it aside, she blinked against the brightness of the morning. The secluded camp of the night before had been a temporary stop. Sometime before she had woken, he had moved them. They were now on the edge of a larger settlement, a collection of hide lodges and brush shelters scattered among a grove of cottonwood trees near a shallow, meandering creek. Perhaps a dozen families lived here, their lives unfolding under the vast, open sky. Women tended to cook fires, their movements economical and practiced. Children, naked to the waist, chased each other through the dust, their play punctuated by shouts in a language that was a cascade of harsh and musical sounds to her ears. Her appearance at the lodge entrance brought an immediate and profound stillness. The children stopped their game, their dark eyes wide with a mixture of fear and unabashed curiosity. The women paused in their work, their hands freezing in the middle of stirring pots or scraping hides. They stared at her, their expressions unreadable but for a universal hardness, an appraisal that was both cold and intensely personal. She was the outsider, the white woman. In their gaze, she saw the reflection of her own people's prejudice, a deep and abiding suspicion that needed no words. She felt the color rise in her cheeks, a hot flush of shame and fear, and she quickly retreated back into the relative safety of the lodge. Life in the days that followed was a disorienting blur of learning to live without a language. Every object was a mystery, every custom a riddle. The world she had known, with its predictable routines and clearly defined rules, had been replaced by a life governed by the sun, the seasons, and a complex web of social cues she could not decipher. She learned by watching. She saw how the women moved with a tireless grace, their hands always busy, their connection to the earth so profound it seemed they were a part of it. She was clumsy, useless, a ghost in their midst. When she tried to help, her efforts were met with stony silence or a dismissive gesture. She was tolerated, nothing more, a strange possession her husband had brought home. Tatsi remained a quiet, distant presence. He would leave before dawn each day, a silent figure melting into the landscape, and return at dusk with a rabbit or a brace of quail slung over his shoulder. He never explained where he went or what he did. Their evenings were spent in the familiar silence on opposite sides of the fire. Yet, a subtle shift had begun. He started to teach her, not with lessons, but with simple, direct actions. One evening, he pointed to the fire. "Ijie," he said, his voice low and patient. He repeated the word until she whispered it back, her tongue stumbling over the unfamiliar sound. He pointed to the waterskin. "Tu." He pointed to his horse. "Li." These were her first words in her new life, small stones of understanding in a vast river of confusion. Her education was not confined to words. He taught her how to build a fire with a hand drill, a slow, painstaking process that left her palms raw and her patience in tatters. He would watch her struggle, his face impassive, and only when she was on the verge of weeping with frustration would he silently take the drill, his hands moving with a fluid, hypnotic speed until a wisp of smoke, then a tiny ember, was born. He never praised her, but when she finally succeeded on her own, creating a fragile spark that she nurtured into a flame, she looked up to find him watching, a flicker of something unreadable in his dark eyes. It was not approval, not quite, but it was enough. One afternoon, an old woman approached their lodge. Her face was a beautiful, intricate map of a long life, her eyes deep set and possessing a wisdom that seemed as ancient as the surrounding mesas. Her name, Evelyn would learn, was Naho. She carried a small, upright loom and a bundle of spun yucca fiber. Without a word, she sat on the ground in the shade of the lodge and began to weave, her gnarled fingers moving with a dancer's precision. She did not look at Evelyn, yet Evelyn knew this was a lesson intended for her. For days, she simply watched. Then, one afternoon, Naho held out a shuttle, a silent invitation. Evelyn's first attempts were a disaster. The threads tangled. The tension was uneven. The pattern a chaotic mess. The other women would sometimes pause to watch, their lips curled in faint, knowing smiles. But Naho was endlessly patient. She would not speak, but would reach over and guide Evelyn's clumsy hands, repositioning her fingers, demonstrating the subtle flick of the wrist needed to send the shuttle flying true. It was a language of touch, of shared, silent work. Slowly, painstakingly, Evelyn began to learn. In the rhythmic thump of the baton and the steady passage of the shuttle, she found a strange, meditative peace. She was creating something, however imperfect. She was contributing. Her greatest challenge, and her greatest liberation, was the horse. One morning, Tatsi led his mount to her and gestured for her to climb aboard. She had only ever ridden in a side saddle, a precarious and constricting perch. He expected her to ride astride, like a man, mortified and terrified. She refused. He simply waited, his patience a silent, immovable force. Finally, knowing she had no choice, she awkwardly hiked her skirts and allowed him to lift her onto the horse's bare back. The height was dizzying, the lack of a saddle terrifying. He showed her how to grip with her knees, how to use her weight to guide the animal. Then he took the lead rope and began to walk, leading her on a slow circle around the camp. She clung on, her knuckles white, her body rigid with fear. But as the days passed, fear slowly gave way to a thrilling sense of control. The horse was strong and steady beneath her, its power becoming an extension of her own will. For the first time since her arrival, she felt a sense of freedom, the wind in her hair a promise that her world was larger than the confines of the lodge. One day, the need for salt and flour required a trip to a trading post several miles away, a dusty outpost that served as a point of contact between the settlers and the native tribes. The thought of re-entering the white world filled Evelyn with a peculiar dread. As they approached, she saw a familiar figure lounging by the entrance, a lanky man with sandy hair and a weak chin. It was Thomas Briggs. His father owned a claim that bordered her family's land, and Thomas had been a persistent, if unwelcome, suitor for the past year. His eyes widened in disbelief when he saw her. He strode forward, his face a mask of outrage. "Evelyn, good Lord, what has he done to you? Are you a prisoner?" He reached for her horse's bridle, but Tatsi moved between them, a swift, silent shadow. He did not draw a weapon. He did not speak. He simply stood there, his stillness more menacing than any threat. "You get away from her!" You hear Thomas sputtered, his bravado faltering under Tatsi's cold gaze. "She is a good Christian woman. She does not belong with the likes of you." He turned his appeal to Evelyn. "Your father must have been mad. Come with me. I will take you back to your own kind." Evelyn looked at Thomas, at his pale, sweating face, his eyes full of a possessive pity that made her skin crawl. He saw her as a stained object to be rescued, a prize to be reclaimed. Then she looked at Tatsi, who stood as immovable as the mountains, his presence a silent shield. He was not protecting a possession. He was protecting his wife. In that moment, the choice was startlingly clear. "I am where I belong." "Thomas," she said, her voice quiet but firm. The words surprised her as much as they did him. Thomas stared at her, his mouth agape. Then his face hardened into an ugly sneer. He spat on the ground near Tatsi's feet before turning and stalking away, throwing a final, venomous look over his shoulder. The encounter left Evelyn shaken, but as they rode away from the trading post, she felt not fear, but a strange sense of clarity, the world she had left behind, with its suffocating expectations and its self-righteous men like Thomas Briggs, seemed far more threatening than the quiet, challenging world she now inhabited. That evening, as they sat by the fire, a comfortable silence settled between them. She had been practicing her weaving, and her hands, though still clumsy, moved with a growing confidence. Tatsi was sharpening the head of an arrow, his focus absolute. She looked at his hands, strong and capable, the same hands that had set her father's leg, that had taught her to make fire, that had patiently guided her own. She was beginning to understand that words were the least important form of communication. Honor, respect, patience, protection, these were not spoken. They were demonstrated. They were lived. She looked across the flames at her husband, and for the first time, a small, shy smile touched her lips. He glanced up, his work momentarily forgotten, and after a long, quiet moment, a slow, almost imperceptible smile answered her own. It was a fleeting expression, there and gone in a heartbeat, but it felt more profound than 1,000 spoken words. It was the beginning of a new language, one they were creating together in the heart of the silent desert. The seasons in the high desert did not so much change as they shifted in intensity. The hammer of summer slowly eased, and the air in the mornings took on a crystalline edge. The sun was still strong, but the shadows it cast were longer, and a deeper shade of blue. Weeks had turned into months, and Evelyn's life had found a new, quiet rhythm. The language of silence had become her own. She could now understand the subtle shift in Naho's posture that meant a storm was coming, or the particular way Tatsi's horse flicked its ears when a coyote was near. She was no longer a ghost in the village. The women's eyes had softened from suspicion to a kind of watchful acceptance. She had a place. She had her work at the loom, her small duties, and the vast, silent companionship of the land itself. The peace was shattered late one afternoon. The sun was a fiery orange ball descending toward the western mesas, and the camp was bathed in a warm, sleepy light. Evelyn sat with Naho outside the lodge, her fingers moving with a newfound confidence through the threads of her weaving. A sudden chorus of barking from the camp's dogs broke the calm, sharp and agitated. The women looked up, their hands stilling. A rider was approaching, not with the easy, familiar pace of an Apache returning from a hunt, but with a clumsy, aggressive urgency that sent a plume of red dust billowing behind him. Evelyn's heart seized. She recognized the slumped posture, the unsteady way the man held the reins. It was Thomas Briggs. He rode directly into the center of the camp, as if he owned it, pulling his horse to a jarring halt that made the animal sidestep nervously. He was not the same man she had seen at the trading post. His face was flushed, his eyes bloodshot and wild. The smell of whiskey reached her even from a distance, a sour and volatile scent on the clean desert air. He swung himself out of the saddle, stumbling as his boots hit the ground. The women of the village began to quietly gather their children, pulling them back into the shadows of the lodges, their movements swift and silent as startled quail. A few of the older men who were in camp appeared, their faces grim, their hands resting loosely on the handles of the knives at their belts. A silent, watchful circle formed, with Thomas and Evelyn at its center. "Evelyn," he bellowed, his voice a harsh intrusion in the quiet air. "I have come for you. This madness has gone on long enough." He took a few unsteady steps toward her, his eyes scanning the camp with open disgust. "Look at this place, living in the dirt like animals. And you, look what they have done to you." His gaze raked over her simple hide dress and the moccasins on her feet. "I am taking you home, back to civilization." Naho rose slowly to her feet, her ancient eyes fixed on Thomas with an expression of pure, cold contempt. But Evelyn put a hand on the old woman's arm, a small gesture to stay back. The fear was there, a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it was a harder, unfamiliar emotion. It was anger. This man, with his sour breath and his blind arrogance, was desecrating her home. "This is my home now." "Thomas," she said, her voice shaking only slightly, "you need to leave." A humorless laugh escaped his lips. "Your home, do not be a fool. You are their captive, their plaything. Your father sold you, but I am here to rescue you." He lunged forward then, his intentions finally breaking through the haze of his drunken words. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh with a painful, bruising force. "You are coming with me. Now." Evelyn cried out, a sharp sound of pain and outrage. She struggled against his grip, but he was stronger, his determination fueled by liquor and wounded pride. He began to drag her toward his horse, his words slurring into a stream of insults aimed at the silent, watching people. And then he was there. Tatsi did not ride into camp. He did not shout or run. He simply materialized at the edge of the circle, as if he had been formed from the evening shadows themselves. He must have been returning from the hills, but he moved with such utter silence that no one had marked his approach. One moment, Thomas was dragging a struggling Evelyn across the clearing, and the next, Tatsi stood in his path. He was completely still. He carried a bow in one hand and a single rabbit in the other. He did not look angry. He looked as calm and as lethal as a coiled snake. The air crackled, the sudden tension so thick it was hard to breathe. Thomas froze, his hand still clamped on Evelyn's arm. He stared at Tatsi, his drunken bravado momentarily failing him. "You stay back," he stammered, his voice losing its confident bluster. "This is white folks' business." Tatsi did not respond. He simply dropped the rabbit and the bow to the ground, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face. That was his only acknowledgement that a fight was at hand. The deliberate, unhurried movement seemed to unnerve Thomas more than a direct threat. He shoved Evelyn away from him and fumbled at his hip, his hand closing around the butt of a large revolver. "I am warning you," he shouted, his voice cracking. He pulled the weapon, its metal barrel catching the last rays of the setting sun. What happened next was a blur, too fast for Evelyn's frightened mind to fully process. As Thomas raised the revolver, Tatsi moved. He did not charge. He flowed forward, covering the ground between them in two impossibly swift strides. There was a sharp, precise movement of his hands, a cry of pain from Thomas. The heavy revolver spun through the air and landed with a soft thud in the dust. Thomas was on his knees, clutching his wrist, his face a mask of shock and agony. Tatsi stood over him, not even breathing hard. The entire camp had held its breath, and now a collective, quiet sigh seemed to pass through the people. Tatsi bent down, picked up the revolver, and checked it with an expert's familiarity. Then he looked at the pathetic, whimpering man at his feet. Evelyn watched, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was the moment she had always feared, the moment the savage would be revealed. The law of this land was simple and brutal. Thomas had come into their home, threatened a woman, and drawn a weapon. His life was forfeit. She expected Tatsi to use the gun, or the knife she knew was sheathed at his back. But he did not. He looked from Thomas to the gun in his hand, and then his gaze settled on Evelyn. She saw the fire in his eyes then, and it was not the cold, detached fury of a killer. It was a blaze, a white-hot, protective inferno that was directed not at the man on the ground, but at the threat he represented. It was the fierce, untamable instinct of a man defending his own. In that moment, she understood that the most dangerous thing in the world was not his anger, but the thing that he chose to protect. With a sudden movement, Tatsi ejected the bullets from the revolver, letting them fall into the dust like useless seeds. He tossed the empty weapon onto the ground beside its owner. Then he reached down, grabbed the front of Thomas's shirt, and hauled him to his feet with effortless strength. He pushed him, hard, toward his horse. "Go," Tatsi said, his voice low and guttural, the first word he had spoken. "Do not return." Thomas scrambled onto his horse, his face pale with terror and humiliation. He fumbled with the reins, kicked the animal into a frantic gallop, and fled from the camp, disappearing back into the twilight from which he had come. The silence he left behind was profound. The men of the village retrieved Tatsi's bow and the rabbit. Naho came to Evelyn's side and gently touched the arm that Thomas had grabbed, her old eyes asking a question Evelyn could not answer. She shook her head, indicating she was unharmed, and the old woman nodded, melting back into the crowd. Soon, only she and Tatsi remained in the center of the clearing. He walked over and picked up the bullets, one by one, and put them in a small pouch at his belt. He did not look at her. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving Evelyn trembling, her legs feeling weak and unsteady. She had to say something. The words caught in her throat, small and inadequate. "Thank you," she whispered, the sound barely audible. Tatsi finally turned to face her. The fire was gone from his eyes, replaced by that familiar, deep stillness. He looked at her trembling form, at the red marks already forming on her arm. His expression was impossible to read, but his voice, when he spoke, was steady and absolute. "You are my wife," he said, as if it were the simplest, most obvious fact in the world. "I protect you." He then bent to pick up his rabbit, turned, and went into their lodge as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Evelyn stood alone in the gathering dark, the cool night air raising goosebumps on her skin. She was no longer afraid of him. The terrifying, shadowy figure of her imagination had been completely and irrevocably replaced by the man who had stood between her and a loaded gun. The last vestiges of her old fear had burned away in the fire she had seen in his eyes, and in its place, a new and far more powerful fear was beginning to grow. It was the terrifying, heart-stopping realization that she was beginning to be afraid of a world that did not have him in it. The aftermath of Thomas Briggs's intrusion was not a ripple, but a profound shift in the currents of the camp. His violent trespass had broken a taboo, and Tatsi's measured, decisive response had been a public affirmation. Evelyn was no longer an appendage, a strange white curiosity. She was the wife of a warrior who had defended his home, and she, in turn, had not fled with the man of her own race. She had stood her ground. A new kind of respect was afforded her, a quiet acknowledgement that was visible in the way the other women would now meet her eyes, or how a child might offer her a smooth, interesting stone found by the creek. The space around her had warmed, but the most significant change occurred within the small, smoky confines of their lodge. The silence that had once been a chasm of uncertainty between her and Tatsi was now a space of quiet contemplation. The fear was gone, and in its absence, Evelyn found herself truly seeing him for the first time. She noticed the way his hands, so capable of both lethal speed and gentle precision, would carefully mend a tear in a moccasin. She saw the lines of exhaustion around his eyes when he returned late from a long hunt, and the way his shoulders would relax almost imperceptibly as he sat by the warmth of their fire. She began to learn the landscape of his moods not through words, but through the subtle set of his jaw or the rhythm of his breathing as he slept. A delicate, trembling shyness grew in her heart, a feeling far more unnerving than her old fear had ever been. He, too, seemed to be observing her in a new way. Occasionally, she would look up from her loom to find his gaze upon her, his dark eyes holding a thoughtful, searching quality she had not seen before. He saw that the perpetual anxiety that had tightened her mouth was gone, replaced by a quiet composure. He saw that her hands, once soft and clumsy, were now becoming deft and calloused from her work. He saw her speak a few words of his language to Naho, and he saw the old woman's answering smile. He was watching her become. For several evenings, after he had eaten and sharpened his tools, he worked on a small, private task. He would take a piece of pale bone, likely from the wing of a large bird, and a sharp flint knife, and he would carve. He worked with an intense, patient focus, his body angled away from her so she could not see the object taking shape in his hands. The soft, rhythmic scrape of flint against bone became a familiar sound, the new music of their shared silence. She did not ask what he was making. She knew that in this world, things were revealed in their own time. Then, one evening when the air was crisp and the stars seemed close enough to touch, he finished. He held the object in his palm for a long moment, rubbing his thumb over its smooth surface, before he rose and came to her side of the fire. She looked up from the basket she was mending, her heart giving a sudden, curious leap. He knelt before her, the firelight casting a warm glow on his stoic face, and opened his hand. Resting on his palm was a pendant. It was carved from the wing bone, polished to a soft, milky luster. It was the shape of a hawk in full flight, its wings outstretched, its head turned as if catching a current of wind only it could feel. The detail was breathtaking. He had etched every individual feather with a painstaking precision, capturing the wild, fierce beauty of the creature in the small, inanimate object. A thin leather cord was threaded through a small hole drilled at the top. He did not offer it immediately. He simply held it for her to see. She reached out a tentative hand, not to take it, but to lightly touch its surface. It was cool and smooth beneath her fingertip. "It is for you," he said, his voice a low murmur that was almost lost in the crackle of the fire. She looked from the pendant to his face, her eyes wide with a question she could not voice. Why? He seemed to understand. He closed his hand over the pendant for a moment, then met her gaze. "The hawk," he said, the English words deliberate and full of meaning. "It is strong, it is free." Her breath caught in her throat. He was not just giving her a piece of jewelry. He was giving her a name. He was telling her what he saw when he looked at her. Not the frightened, timid girl who had cried on her wedding night, but someone strong. Someone who had found a different kind of freedom in this vast, open land. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, hot and sudden. "It is beautiful," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He placed the pendant in her open palm. Its weight was negligible, yet it felt as substantial as a stone from the riverbed. She held it for a moment, then turned it over, examining the simple leather cord. The knot was small and tight. She fumbled with it, trying to open the loop enough to slip it over her head, but her fingers were clumsy, shaking slightly. A wave of frustration and shyness washed over her. She had to ask. It felt like a monumental request, a crossing of some invisible, unspoken boundary. She took a steadying breath. Will you help me?" She turned her back to him, a gesture of complete and unthinking trust. She pulled her long hair to one side, exposing the pale, vulnerable nape of her neck to him and the cool night air. She held the pendant against the hollow of her throat and waited, her body still, her heart thumping a slow, heavy rhythm. She felt him move behind her, a subtle shift of air and warmth. She expected him to simply take the cord and tie it. Instead, she felt the barest, lightest touch of his fingertips against her skin as he took the two ends of the leather cord from her. The contact was electric, a small spark that shot through her entire body. His fingers were calloused and warm, and the unexpected intimacy of his touch on such a sensitive part of her body made her gasp, a tiny, sharp intake of air. She froze, every nerve ending suddenly alive and singing. He must have felt her reaction, the sudden tension in her shoulders, but his hands remained steady. He worked the knot with a quiet efficiency, his fingers brushing against her neck with each movement. It could not have taken more than a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. A single, suspended moment in time where the world consisted only of the cool air, the warm fire, and the shocking, gentle touch of his hands. When he was done, his hands fell away. The sudden absence of his touch left her feeling strangely bereft. The hawk pendant now rested against her collarbone, a cool weight on her warm skin. She sat for a long moment with her back still to him, gathering her composure, her mind reeling. She could still feel the phantom sensation of his fingers on her skin. Slowly, she turned to face him. Her intention was to thank him, but the words died on her lips as her eyes met his. He was still kneeling before her, his face illuminated by the fire, and the distance was gone. For months they had lived on opposite sides of this fire, separated by a gulf of culture, language, and fear. Now, in the space of a single, silent moment, that gulf had vanished. She saw in his eyes a deep and profound tenderness, a raw emotion that stripped away his stoic mask entirely. And he, in turn, saw the open, unguarded vulnerability in her own gaze. He saw the trust. He saw the dawning of a feeling that neither of them had a name for yet. They stayed like that, caught in a silent communion, the world shrinking to the space between them. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks into the dark sky, but neither of them noticed. The barrier had not just been crossed, it had dissolved into nothing. Later that night, the comfortable quiet had returned, but it was a different substance now. It was fuller, richer, woven through with the threads of their shared, unspoken moment. She sat on her side of the fire, her fingers unconsciously tracing the outline of the hawk at her throat. He was tending to the flames, pushing a log into a better position with a stick. He settled back on his furs, his work done, and sat watching the flames dance. His hand rested on the ground between them, palm up, relaxed. Evelyn looked at it, at the long, strong fingers, the scattering of old scars, without thinking, without allowing her shyness to stop her. She reached out and laid her hand lightly on his. He did not flinch or pull away. His hand was warm and dry, and after a moment of stillness, his fingers curled around hers, his thumb stroking gently over her knuckles. It was a simple, easy gesture, as natural and as necessary as breathing. It felt like coming home. They sat like that for a long time, their hands clasped, the firelight warming their faces. The silence was a soft blanket around them. Finally, he turned his head and looked at her, his gaze soft in the flickering light. He looked at her face, which was calm and serene, her eyes shining with a light that had not been there months before. "You are finding your heart," he said softly. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, an observation from a man who saw everything. He was not talking about her finding affection for him. He was talking about her own journey. He understood that her journey into his world had also been a journey into herself. And here, in this wild and improbable place, holding the hand of the man she had once feared above all else, she knew that he was right. She had found it, or perhaps it had found her. The quiet intimacy that had bloomed between them in the wake of the hawk pendant's gifting was a fragile and beautiful thing, like a desert flower that opens its petals to the cool of the night. Their days settled into a new pattern, one woven not just with shared tasks, but with shared glances, small, unconscious gestures of closeness, and a deepening comfort in each other's presence. The fire in their lodge no longer felt like a barrier, but a shared hearth. Sometimes, as she worked, she would feel his eyes on her and look up to see an expression of such profound tenderness on his face that it made her own heart ache with a sweet, unfamiliar joy. And sometimes he would reach across the space between them and simply take her hand, his thumb stroking her skin in a silent conversation that needed no words. She was happy. The realization of it would sometimes strike her with the force of a physical blow, a stunning and improbable truth. She, Evelyn Carter, sold in marriage to an Apache warrior, was happier than she had ever been in her life. This delicate piece was a shelter built on borrowed time. The wider world, which for months had seemed a distant and irrelevant memory, began to press in on them. Its anxieties carried on the wind like the scent of a far-off storm. It began with whispers. A rider from another band, his horse lathered and near collapse, would appear with grim news of surveyors marking land that had been promised by treaty. Then came stories of prospectors, emboldened by the discovery of gold in the mountains, encroaching on sacred hunting grounds, their arrogance leading to inevitable clashes. The tension in the camp grew, a low hum of unease beneath the surface of daily life. The men began to spend more time cleaning their rifles, their faces set in hard, grim lines. The women's talk around the cook fires grew hushed and anxious. The breaking point came with the arrival of soldiers. They did not come to their small settlement, not at first. They established a new fort some 30 miles to the south, a raw scar of felled trees and freshly dug earth on the open plain. From this fort, patrols began to fan out, their blue uniforms a stark and menacing presence against the muted reds and browns of the landscape. They came with accusations. A cow stolen from a white settler was blamed on the Apache. A fire at a remote ranch was laid at their feet. Every incident, no matter how small or unsubstantiated, was treated as an act of war, an excuse for retaliation. The stories that trickled back to their camp grew darker. A hunting party ambushed and killed. A small, peaceful village of old ones and children attacked at dawn, its people scattered or slain. The war was no longer a distant rumor. It was a tightening net, Death was a constant specter on the horizon, its shadow touching everything. Tatsi changed. The quiet peace that had settled in his eyes was replaced by a familiar, hard watchfulness. He became more silent than ever. His thoughts turned inward, his gaze constantly scanning the distant hills. He spent his days away, not hunting, but scouting, tracking the movements of the soldiers, trying to read the future in the dust of their patrols. When he returned to the lodge at night, he brought the cold of the wilderness in with him, a weight of responsibility that seemed to bow his strong shoulders. Evelyn felt a chasm opening between them once more, but this time it was not one of fear or misunderstanding. It was a chasm of sorrow. She saw the impossible choice he was facing, the terrible calculus of survival. He was a leader among his people, his first duty sworn to their protection. But he had a wife whose white skin, once a potential bridge between their worlds, was now a profound and terrible liability. To the soldiers, she would be seen as a captive, her presence among the Apache a justification for attack, and to some of his own people. In this time of fear and suspicion, she could be seen as an omen, a weakness, a potential traitor. He was caught between two worlds, with the woman he loved standing at the fracturing heart of it all. The end came on an evening when the sky was on fire. The setting sun had painted the clouds in violent streaks of crimson and orange, as if the heavens were reflecting the bloodshed on the earth below. A scout had returned an hour before with the news they had all been dreading. A large column of soldiers was moving in their direction, their progress slow but relentless. They would be upon the village by morning. There was no panic, only a grim, focused haste. The women began to pack, bundling dried meat, water skins, and essential tools into compact bundles. The children, sensing the terror in the air, were silent and wide-eyed. The men prepared their weapons, their movements economical and deadly serious. They were preparing to run, to melt into the canyons and the mountains where they might survive. Tatsi came into the lodge. He did not help her pack. He stood by the entrance flap and watched her for a long moment, his face an unreadable mask of stone. But in his eyes, she saw an agony so deep it stole her breath. "You cannot come with us," he said. The words were quiet, devoid of emotion, but they struck her with the force of a physical blow. She stared at him, unable to comprehend. "What are you saying? This is my home. These are my people. I will not leave you." "This will not be a home tomorrow," he answered, his voice still flat, detached. "It will be a battlefield, or a graveyard. They will not spare you because of the color of your skin. They will see you as a captive, and your rescue will be their excuse. And my people, they must move fast. They must be ghosts. They cannot be burdened." The word burdened hung in the air between them, sharp and cruel. But she understood. He was not saying she was a burden to him. He was saying her safety was a separate war he could not fight while trying to save his people. "Then I will fight with you," she said, her voice rising with a desperate defiance. A flicker of pain crossed his face. "You do not know how to fight this war, Evelyn. To survive, we must become shadows. You would be a flame in the dark. They would find us through you." He came to her then and took her by the arms. His grip was gentle but unbreakable. "There is a mission camp, 2 days' ride to the east. It is run by priests. You will be safe there. You must go, now." The tears she had refused to shed now came, hot and blinding. "No," she begged, her voice breaking. "Do not send me away. I would rather die here with you than live in safety without you." He looked down at her, and the stone of his face finally cracked. The pain he had been holding back flooded his eyes. "That is a choice you do not have," he said, his voice raw with a grief that mirrored her own. "Your life is not yours to throw away. It is mine, and I will not see it lost." He pulled her closer, his hands framing her face. He looked at her as if trying to memorize every line, every feature. "Listen to me," he commanded, his voice low and urgent. This is the only way. If you go, you live. And if you live, I come for you after. It was a promise, a fragile, impossible promise made on the edge of an abyss. But it was all she had. She clung to it, to him, her sobs shaking her entire body. He held her tight for one last, desperate moment, and she could feel the frantic, heavy beat of his heart against her own. Then he put his hands on her shoulders and gently pushed her back. He leaned in and pressed his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. It was not a kiss. It was something more profound, a meeting of spirits, a final, silent communion of love and despair. She could feel his breath on her skin, smell the familiar scent of wood smoke and sage that was him. "Go," he whispered, his voice a ragged tear in the fabric of the evening. He released her, turned, and was gone from the lodge. A moment later, a young boy appeared at the entrance, leading one of the horses, a small bundle of food and a water skin already tied to its back. Naho was there too. She pressed a small, heavy object into Evelyn's hand. It was the hawk pendant. Evelyn's fingers closed around it, its smooth, cool surface a stark contrast to the fire in her heart. The old woman looked at her, her ancient eyes full of a sorrow that needed no translation. And then she too was gone. Evelyn moved as if in a dream. She allowed the boy to help her onto the horse. As she settled herself, she looked back at the camp. It was a hive of frantic, silent activity under the blood-red sky. She saw Tatsi, standing with the other men, a rifle in his hand, his back to her, already a part of the war he had to fight. He did not look back. He could not. She turned the horse and nudged it into a walk, then a trot, away from the only home she had ever truly known, away from the only man she had ever loved. As she cleared the cottonwood grove, she could hear it in the distance, a faint, popping sound carried on the evening breeze. Gunfire. From the south. The war had begun. She kicked the horse into a gallop, the sounds of her own weeping lost in the drumming of its hooves. She fled into the encroaching darkness, a lone rider under a burning sky, her hand clenched around a small piece of bone carved into the shape of a hawk, a symbol of a blind, desperate, and utterly unbreakable promise. The mission of San Xavier del Bac was a place of bells and shadows. Its thick adobe walls absorbed the relentless Arizona sun, creating a cool, perpetual twilight within its corridors. Life here was measured and orderly, marked by the tolling of the bell for matins, for vespers, for the Angelus, for Evelyn. It was a clean and quiet purgatory. She had been received with a gentle, pitying kindness by the black-robed priests, who saw her as a brand plucked from the burning, a poor, traumatized soul rescued from the clutches of savages. They gave her a small, whitewashed room, simple chores in the garden and the laundry, and an abundance of prayers. She moved through her days in a fog of quiet obedience. She existed. She survived. But she did not live. Her spirit had remained behind in the burning sky, somewhere in the vast and silent wilderness with Tatsi. The hawk pendant, which she kept hidden beneath the neckline of her drab mission dress, was her only tangible link to the life that had been stolen from her. In the lonely darkness of her cell at night, she would hold it, its smooth, cool surface a repository for all her memories, all her hopes, and all her fears. His promise, "I come for you after," was a mantra she repeated to herself, a fragile shield against the encroaching despair. The world outside the mission walls was a place of rumors, and the rumors were uniformly grim. Soldiers would sometimes stop for water and rest, their face grimed with dust, their talk full of a casual brutality that made her stomach churn. They spoke of skirmishes, of raids, of Apache bands relentlessly hunted through the mountains. They spoke of victory. The news that broke her came from a freight driver, a garrulous man happy to share the latest tidbits from the territorial capital in exchange for a hot meal. He spoke of a final, decisive battle in a place called Skeleton Canyon. A renegade Apache war chief, he said, a stubborn holdout, had been cornered and his small band wiped out. The driver, puffing with self-importance, even mentioned a name he had overheard. Tatsi. The soldiers were calling it the end of the Apache problem in the territory. The words did not make Evelyn scream or faint. They simply fell into the emptiness inside her and extinguished the last flickering ember of hope. The freight driver's voice faded. The clatter of plates in the refectory receded to a distant hum. The world went silent and gray. Tatsi was dead. The promise was broken. The hawk pendant in her hand was no longer a symbol of a future reunion, but a cold, hard memorial to a life that was over. From that day on, she was no longer a survivor in purgatory. She was a ghost. She performed her duties with the same quiet efficiency, but her eyes were vacant, her soul gone. Father Michael, the elderly priest in charge of the mission, watched her with concern. He would try to speak to her of God's mysterious ways, of finding peace in acceptance. She would nod and thank him, but his words were a foreign language, describing a faith she no longer possessed. Her only faith had been in a promise, and that promise now lay buried in the bloody dirt of some distant canyon. Weeks bled into one another. The fierce heat of late summer gave way to the cool, sharp nights of autumn. One evening, the sky, which had been a clear, merciless blue for months, turned a bruised and angry purple. The wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that rattled the wooden shutters and sent dust devils dancing through the mission courtyard. A storm was coming, one of the violent, sudden tempests that could tear the desert apart. Evelyn could not sleep. The wind sounded like a legion of grieving spirits, and the first fat drops of rain that began to strike her small window pane sounded like weeping. She rose from her cot and went to the window, peering out into the maelstrom. The night was a churning chaos of wind and water, illuminated in brief, stark flashes by jagged forks of lightning. It was a world being washed clean, a world in torment, a fitting reflection of the storm inside her own soul. She stood there for what felt like hours, her forehead pressed against the cool glass, watching the deluge. Then, in the split-second clarity of a lightning flash, she saw it, a shape, a figure, dark and indistinct, huddled against the far wall of the courtyard, seeking what little shelter the overhang of the roof provided. Her first thought was that it was one of the Pima converts who lived near the mission, caught out in the storm. But another flash of lightning came, longer this time, and it illuminated the figure more clearly. It was a man, tall and lean, his dark hair plastered to his head by the rain. He was standing, but he was leaning heavily against the wall, as if his legs could no longer support him. There was something in the posture, in the line of the shoulders, that sent a shock, cold and sharp, through her entire body. It was a shape her heart knew, a silhouette imprinted on her soul. Her mind screamed that it was impossible. It was a trick of the light, a phantom born of her grief. He was dead. And yet, she did not make a conscious decision. Her body acted on its own, propelled by a force more powerful than reason. She turned from the window, fumbled for the latch on her door, and pulled it open. The corridor was dark and silent. She ran, her bare feet making no sound on the cool flagstones. She reached the heavy outer door of the mission, her hands struggling with a thick iron bolt. It groaned in protest, but she threw her entire weight against it, and it slid back with a deafening clang. She threw the door open and ran out into the storm. The wind and rain hit her with the force of a physical blow, stealing her breath and plastering her thin cotton shift to her skin in an instant. The courtyard was a river of churning mud. She did not care. Her eyes were fixed on the shadow against the far wall. She ran, stumbling, sliding, her feet numb with cold, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. Tatsi. The name was ripped from her throat, a raw cry that was almost swallowed by the roar of the wind. The figure stirred. He pushed himself away from the wall and took a single, unsteady step toward her, his face a pale blur in the tempest. It was him, thinner, haggard, but it was him. She reached him and collided with him, her arms wrapping around his soaking body, clinging to him with a desperate, frantic strength. He was real, he was solid, he was not a ghost. He was shivering violently, his body radiating a terrifying heat that had nothing to do with the cold rain. He grunted in pain as she embraced him, but his arms came up to hold her, his grip surprisingly strong. He buried his face in her wet hair, and she felt a shudder pass through his entire frame. She looked up at him, the rain streaming down her face, mingling with the hot, salty tears that she could not stop. His face was gaunt, his cheekbones sharp beneath the skin, and a deep, ugly gash ran across his forehead. But his eyes, even clouded with fever and exhaustion, were the same. "I said I would come back," he rasped, his voice a raw, broken whisper against her ear. That was all he said. It was all he needed to say. The promise had been kept. Love had crossed a landscape of war and death and had found its way home. But he was fading. She could feel his strength failing, his weight becoming heavier against her. He was burning with fever. A fierce, protective energy surged through her, overriding her grief and her joy. He had come back for her. Now, she would not let him die. She hooked her shoulder under his arm, taking on as much of his weight as she could. "Come," she urged, her voice strong and clear above the storm. "We must get you inside." Somehow, she got him back across the courtyard and through the door. Half dragging, half carrying him, she led him not to her own room, but to a small, unused storage chamber near the laundry, a place where no one would think to look. It was musty and filled with discarded furniture, but it was dry and out of the wind. She helped him to the floor, propping him up against an old wooden chest. She worked with a frantic, focused energy she did not know she possessed. She brought him water. She found old, clean sacks to serve as blankets. She ran to the garden, heedless of the continuing storm, and her hands, guided by a memory of Naho's lessons, found the herbs she needed: willow bark for the fever, a pungent root for cleansing wounds. All through the long, dark night, she fought for his life. As the storm raged outside, she waged her own war inside the small, dark room. She bathed his face with cool water, trying to bring the fever down. She cleaned the gash on his forehead and the other, deeper wound she found on his side, a ragged tear that looked to have been made by a soldier's bayonet. She crushed the herbs and made a poultice, her hands moving with a sureness that surprised her. She trickled water between his cracked lips. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his body sometimes rigid with chills, at other times limp with a terrifying stillness. In his delirium, he spoke in his own language, the words sharp and urgent. She could not understand them, but she understood the pain. She held his hand, her fingers wrapped tightly around his, willing her own strength into him. And as she worked, she prayed, not the rote, hollow prayers of the mission, but a raw, desperate litany that came from the deepest part of her soul. She prayed to the Christian God of her childhood. She prayed to the desert spirits she had come to respect. She prayed to the hawk, to the wind, to the rain, and she talked to him, her words a constant, low murmur. "Do not leave me," she whispered, her lips close to his ear. "You came back. You promised. You cannot leave me now. I love you. Do you hear me? Tatsi, I love you. Stay with me. Please, stay." The storm finally broke just before dawn. The wind died down, and the rain softened to a gentle patter. In the quiet gray light of the new day, she felt a change. The fierce heat radiating from his body began to subside. His shivering stopped. His breathing, which had been shallow and ragged, deepened into the slow, steady rhythm of true sleep. She put her hand on his forehead. It was cool, The fever had broken. He would live. A wave of exhaustion so profound that it was almost painful washed over her. She laid her head down on his chest, listening to the steady, miraculous beat of his heart, and for the first time in a very long time, she slept. For 3 days and 3 nights, the small, musty storage room was their entire world. Evelyn moved with a quiet, fierce purpose, a guardian against the death that had followed Tatsi to the mission walls. She stole food from the kitchen, broth and bread that she would coax him to eat. She kept his wounds clean and her prayers constant. He slept for most of that time, a deep, healing sleep that slowly mended his broken body. When he was awake, his eyes, clear now of the fever's haze, would follow her every movement. He was too weak to speak much, but his gaze was a language she now understood fluently. It spoke of a gratitude so profound it was humbling, and of a love that had been tested by fire and had emerged as strong and as pure as tempered steel. On the 3rd morning, he sat up on his own, the borrowed blankets pooled around his waist. He looked at his bandaged side, then at her, his face thin and weary, but his own again. "You saved me," he said, his voice still a rough whisper. She shook her head, a small smile touching her lips. "You kept your promise. I was simply returning the favor." The quiet intimacy of their sanctuary could not last. They both knew it. He was an Apache warrior, a fugitive in the eyes of the soldiers. The mission, for all its kindness, was a cage. His presence endangered not only themselves, but the good priests who had unwittingly sheltered them. They had to leave. They had to return to the wilderness, to the mountains, and try to find what was left of his people. Their departure was a reversal of his arrival, a silent escape into a stormy night. The weather had turned again, a cold, driving rain providing cover for their flight. Evelyn gathered what she could: a small sack of bread, a skin of water, and the herbal remedies she had prepared. As they were about to slip out through a little used postern gate, a figure holding a lantern appeared in the corridor. It was Father Michael. The old priest stood for a long moment, his gentle, wrinkled face illuminated by the lantern's soft glow. He looked at Evelyn, dressed once more in her practical hide dress which she had kept hidden. He looked at Tatsi, who stood beside her, weakened but resolute, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. The priest's eyes held no condemnation, only a deep, weary sorrow for a world so full of conflict. He did not speak of sin or betrayal. He simply stepped aside, holding the lantern high to light their way. "Vaya con Dios," he whispered. "Go with God. May you find the peace that this world cannot seem to offer." He pushed a small, heavy sack into Evelyn's hands. It was filled with dried corn and salt. It was a blessing. Evelyn met his eyes and saw not a priest, but a man, and she gave him a look of profound gratitude before she and Tatsi slipped out into the rain and the darkness, leaving that world behind for the last time. The journey into the mountains was the hardest thing she had ever done. They traveled by night and hid during the day, moving like the ghosts Tatsi had said his people must become. He was still weak, and the pace was slow and arduous. But with each day that passed, he grew stronger. The mountains welcomed him, nourished him. He taught her how to read the tracks of animals, how to find water where none seemed to exist, how to listen to the whispers of the wind. She, in turn, tended to his wounds and made sure he rested, her quiet strength a constant support. They were no longer a warrior and his wife. They were partners in survival, two halves of a single, resolute whole. After 2 weeks of travel, they found them in a high hidden valley, protected by sheer rock walls and ancient pine trees. They saw the faint wisps of cook fires. It was a ghost of the village she had known. Only a handful of families had survived, their faces etched with loss and hardship, but they had survived. Naho was there. The old woman saw them first, and her stern, wrinkled face broke into a rare, beautiful smile. She embraced Evelyn, her small, frail body surprisingly strong. A silent, powerful welcome that meant more than any words. But their reception by the others was more guarded. They were relieved to see Tatsi, their leader, returned from the dead. But their eyes on Evelyn were full of a new kind of suspicion. She was a reminder of the world that had hunted them, that had taken their families and their homes. That evening, the elders called a council. They sat around a large, central fire, their faces like carved stone in the flickering light. Tatsi and Evelyn were told to stand before them. The chief elder, a man whose eyes held the accumulated sorrow of his people, looked not at Tatsi, but at Evelyn. His gaze was heavy, searching. "You led our war chief back to us," the elder said, his voice a low rumble. "For this, we are grateful, but the question must be asked. Why did you bring her back into our midst? She is one of them. She is a symbol of the world that has destroyed us." The silence that followed was absolute. Every eye was on Tatsi. This was the final test, the last and highest barrier. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, but she stood tall, meeting the elder's gaze without flinching. She would accept their judgment. Tatsi did not hesitate. He stepped forward, his voice clear and strong, ringing with a conviction that echoed through the silent valley. "I brought her back because she is not one of them," he said, his eyes sweeping over the faces around the fire. "I brought her back because when the soldiers came, she wanted to fight with us. I brought her back because when I was broken and near death, she was the one who saved me." He turned then and looked directly at Evelyn, and his voice softened, filled with an emotion so powerful it made the air tremble. "I brought her back because she did not run when others did. She is my courage. She is my home." He had laid his heart bare for his people to see. He had redefined her not as an outsider, but as the very center of his world. The elder stared at Tatsi for a long moment, and then his gaze shifted to Evelyn. He saw the strength in her stance, the unwavering loyalty in her eyes. He saw the truth of Tatsi's words. Slowly, deliberately, the old man gave a single, solemn nod. It was done. She was accepted. She was one of them. In the weeks that followed, a new life began. They built a new home, a small, sturdy lodge nestled against the protective wall of the canyon. The wounds of the people began to heal, not with forgetting, but with the quiet resilience of a people who had endured the unthinkable and had survived. Evelyn found her place, not as a guest, but as a daughter, a sister, a wife. The mountains were their fortress, the sky their cathedral. They were free. One brilliant afternoon, she and Tatsi climbed to a high ledge that overlooked their valley. The world spread out below them, a breathtaking tapestry of green pine, red rock, and distant blue mountains. The air was thin and clean, and the sun was warm on their skin. They stood in a comfortable silence for a long time, simply breathing in the beauty and the peace of it all. Evelyn touched the hawk pendant that always rested at her throat. She looked out at the vast, wild horizon, and a slow smile spread across her face. "At 18, she said, her voice soft but clear in the still air. "I cried on my wedding night because I thought my life was over, but now I know it was only beginning." Tatsi turned to her, his own eyes shining with a deep, abiding love. He reached out and his fingers gently brushed against the pendant at her throat, the small, carved bird that had seen them through so much. "And this time," he said, his voice full of a quiet, certain promise, "no one will take it from you." Thank you for being part of our story tonight. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like the video, and press the hype button to help share this story with more listeners.